Well, I have my abacus, I have my slide rule, and I have my drink. Let's talk about The Cellar. The horror streaming service Shudder just released a new film on Friday called The Cellar, and it seems to have been a bit of a hit. All day on Friday, my friends and acquaintances in the horror community were talking about it. The newsfeed on the horror fan social media platform Slasher was full of images from the film as people began watching and discussing it. Early reviews have been mixed to positive, but something that caught a lot of people's attention is that its plot centers on some mathematical ideas. As some of you know, I'm not just a horror guy, but I'm also a math guy. In fact, one of my several degrees is in mathematics, so this movie sounded like it would be right up my alley. I watched it Friday night. That's Friday, April 15th, 2022, in case you're seeing this in the distant future. In which case, greetings and salutations from the past. And on Saturday, I began assembling some notes for this video, even though you're seeing it a little bit later than that. I wanted to wade into this because I think mathematical horror is a rich subgenre to which people haven't paid enough attention in the past. And I mean both audiences and creators when I say that. In the case of The Cellar, while people noted that it has mathematical ideas in it, those ideas seemed to spark some confusion, so I decided to offer my commentary. Let's begin, though, with a brief, spoiler-free review of the film itself. The film opens, as almost any haunted house story does, with a family moving into a new house. There's a mildly creepy scene early on when, while touring the new home, the daughter of the family, Ellie, becomes briefly locked in the cellar, establishing that portion of the house as the heart of all the bad juju. But they quickly move on and forget about the incident until, while babysitting for her younger brother, Ellie again descends the stairs of the cellar and vanishes without a trace. That scene is easily the creepiest and most successful scene of horror in the entire movie. Perhaps that's not surprising, because writer and director Brendan Muldowney essentially copied that scene almost word for word and action for action from his own 2004 short film, The 10 Steps. I'd seen that short film before and quite enjoyed it, but until I saw that scene in the feature-length movie, I hadn't actually made the mental connection that it was the same filmmaker responsible for both of them. But the similarities end there, because while the short film ends on a scare and offers precious little in terms of explanation or aftermath, The Cellar follows with the story of a grief-stricken mother, Kira, searching desperately for her missing child. In order to keep things as spoiler-free as possible, all I'll say about what happens is that she makes certain discoveries along the way, and some of them involve mathematics. When we get to a spoiler section a bit later, I'll go into more detail. There are those who have criticized the film's pacing a bit, arguing that it takes too long to get where it's going. I disagree. After that initial scare, it does take a little while to reach its climax, but I think that's actually a good thing, because what the first and second act are doing is crafting the backstory, establishing the characters, and building the tension to a crescendo. It's true that not a lot of action happens until the final act, but that's how it's supposed to be. The establishing scenes are far from boring. If I can be forgiven for standing on a soapbox for a minute, I think this is actually a bigger problem that we need to address, not only in the horror genre, but in society in general. Attention spans seem to be declining rapidly. I recently heard someone mention that her child didn't like Nightmare on Elm Street because he thought it was too slow and boring. If even that film is considered too slow for the next generation, I fear for the future of any movie that actually has any kind of narrative depth. But that's not to say The Cellar is the deepest of films either. Had I not heard these criticisms, it wouldn't have even occurred to me to think of it as a real slow burn of a movie. It seems to be paced well, and to build just enough backstory and characterization to be satisfying. Although admittedly it does rely a little heavily on the cliché, so a lot of it, while good, doesn't really stand out among all the other haunted house movies out there. So I'd end up calling it a good movie, very much worth watching, but not necessarily a new favorite. The way it does stand out a little bit is that part of the story Kira uncovers throughout the film includes some mathematical ideas, and that's what I really want to focus on for the rest of this video, because there are some interesting things we can say about it, but in order to do so, we're going to need to delve into some minor spoilers. I'm not going to give away all of the ending or anything, but if you don't want me to spoil the mystery for you, I'd recommend you should pause this video now, go watch The Cellar on Shudder, and then come back for the rest of my comments after you've finished. Now that everyone left has seen the movie, one of the interesting things about The Cellar is the series of discoveries Kira makes about her house while trying to investigate her daughter's disappearance. She discovers the house formerly belonged to one Mr. Featherston, a sort of eccentric academic who combined 12th century alchemy with advanced mathematics in a sort of attempt to open a doorway to another dimension, shortly before all but one member of his family disappeared in very much the same way as young Ellie did. This device allows the film to delve into some interesting academic subjects. For example, the doors in the house are each marked with Hebrew characters. Specifically, these are the Hebrew characters Lamed, Vav, Yod, Tav, and Nun. Arranged in the correct order, these letters spell the word Leviathan, which is taken from Judeo-Christian theology and is referenced directly in the books of Job, Isaiah, Psalms, and more. My Jewish theology is not what it should be, but my understanding is that in Judaism, Leviathan is essentially a giant sea monster. But in Christianity, Leviathan has become associated with the demonic. Thomas Aquinas characterized Leviathan as the demon of envy. Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, carried the idea further, identifying Leviathan as one of the 4 crown princes of hell. The symbol of the LaVeyan variant of Satanism is the so-called Sigil of Baphomet, depicting a goat head inside an inverted pentagram. Each point of the star is associated with one of the Hebrew characters of Lamed, Vav, Yod, Tav, and Nun, spelling Leviathan. So there's some theological provenance for the ideas in the movie. However, they never really develop much further than we've just discussed. Leviathan is identified in the film as a sea monster in Jewish lore, and the Sigil of Baphomet does show up in the movie, but the depth of theological musing doesn't really go any deeper than to simply establish Featherston's mysticism as associated with the demonic. That's good enough for the movie, and we don't really require further explanation to drive the plot, but my inner academic found himself repeatedly craving just a little bit more detail. Things do get a little bit more interesting though, because these theological ideas are then loosely connected to mathematics and theoretical physics, and that's what really captured my attention. Beginning early in the film, we find references to mathematics that are repeated both visibly and audibly throughout the film. The visual comes in the form of this equation. Even if you don't know a lot of mathematics, it's pretty easy to recognize as a mathematical expression. We're also treated to an audio recitation in the form of a phonograph recording which says, and here I'm directly quoting, delta, point vector, sum, epsilon, partial 1 equals 1n dy by dx, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then carries on counting indefinitely. A good place to start trying to understand the mathematics of the Cellar would simply be to examine this equation and determine whether it makes any sense. And if we're honest, no it doesn't. It serves its place in the film simply as some mathematical expression that could be used to drive the plot, but the math itself doesn't make a whole lot of sense. At the very least, we'd need to see a lot more of the math to make any sense of it, and at worst, it's just a completely nonsense equation. To begin with, it's clear that the audio and visuals are supposed to be exactly the same equation, but they aren't quite. The Greek letter delta mentioned in the audio looks like a triangle pointed upward. The triangle we see in the equation is the del operator pointed downward, which in vector calculus stands for the gradient. The gradient essentially tells us the direction and rate of fastest increase of a multivariate function. What we see in the equation appears to be the dot product between the gradient and some vector u. That gives us what's called the directional derivative. Essentially, that tells us how the function changes as we move along the direction of the vector, u in this case. That's not quite what the audio says, but I assume delta point vector is just a slightly inaccurate way of describing this dot product. This isn't meant to be a lesson in multivariate calculus, but the simple way to understand it is that pretty much all of calculus is about determining rates of change. The derivative of a function tells us that function's rate of change. When you take calculus 1 or calculus 2, you're dealing with a function in only a single variable, but at some point you move on and take a calculus 3 course in which you start to think in terms of multiple variables and vector calculus. It makes things a bit more complicated, but the fundamental ideas are still the same. On the right side of the equation, we see one in and then a bunch of what look like d's and u's and x's. That's a bit difficult to interpret. We see dx and dy all the time in calculus. A lowercase dx is meant to represent an infinitesimal change in the variable x, and we use those when computing derivatives, or their opposite integrals. When the d is written in the stylized cursive as we see in the film, it refers to a partial derivative, which is a derivative with respect to one of several variables in a multivariate function. However, though it's clear we're talking about multivariate calculus, the equation simply doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's not entirely clear what the letter I is meant to stand for in this equation. The big E-shaped thing in the middle term is a capital letter sigma, which stands for a sum, but it's not clear what the sum of some unidentified variable I is even supposed to mean. Often, when we're summing using this sigma notation, we use a subscript I to index which items are supposed to be summed. But if that's the case here, then the expression doesn't specify what is being summed, but instead just the index. So something's clearly missing. Furthermore, the audio refers to the Greek letter epsilon, and no epsilon appears in the written equation. In the theory of calculus, epsilon usually refers to an arbitrarily small number. You'll encounter them all the time if you ever study real analysis, which is the branch of mathematics dealing with the structure of the real numbers upon which calculus is based. And the relationship between the partial derivatives and the directional derivative doesn't seem to be quite right either. Even if the partial derivatives were themselves properly written, which they don't seem to be, the directional derivative involves a sum, not a product of partial derivatives. Worse, even if everything were correctly written, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense how a simple equation from vector calculus is supposed to be connected to mysticism or to the occult. I can imagine mystical mathematics, but the directional derivative doesn't really do it for me unless we're talking about the derivative of a function that is itself somehow mystical, and we never see such a function in the film. So the equation doesn't really pass the accuracy check, but we're not just here to nitpick about mathematical notation that I had to screenshot just to read over. We're here to see if we can get at any deeper mathematical ideas behind the film's story. The answer to that question is there are some hints of interesting ideas, but they're never deeply explored in the movie. The idea that mathematics can unlock doorways to other dimensions is an interesting one, and The Cellar is far from the first story to play with it. The writings of H.P. Lovecraft, particularly the short story called Dreams in the Witch House, deal rather explicitly with this idea and provide a fairly clear inspiration for The Cellar. I'll do a deep dive into the math of Lovecraft in a future video, so be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss out on that. But to stay focused on just The Cellar, we have to supply a lot of our own interpretations. Some of the ideas I'm going to mention aren't from the film, but they're a way of approaching the idea the film alluded to. So, can math unlock doors to other dimensions? That's actually a deep question with an unknown answer. One thing we can say for sure is there are connections between mathematics and both physics and mysticism, as the film does suggest with its connections to Leviathan, as we've discussed, and theoretical physics, as we'll get to in a moment. Some of the greatest mathematicians of all time have had some mystical leanings. The Pythagoreans, famous now for the simple triangle theorem high school students study, were actually deeply involved in the mystical side of mathematics, to the extent that they're often characterized as a cult. And some biblical scholars have tried to find numerological secrets hidden in the scriptures, and so on and so on. If we take the view, as I do, that mathematics is discovered rather than invented, that is, if we take the view that our mathematics merely describes patterns that actually exist in objective reality, then we have to recognize mathematics as the language in which the universe and the fundamental laws of reality are written. That view admits both pure scientific materialism as well as some forms of mysticism. If one has a mystical view of the universe, then mathematics should be able to unlock those mystical secrets, just as mathematics can unlock the scientific secrets of the universe if one takes a materialist view of things. Whether other dimensions actually exist is not a question that science is yet equipped to answer. But the Cellar does allude to a particular scientific idea that may provide some fuel for the discussion. In one scene, Kira consults with a mathematician who mentions Schrodinger's cat, a famous thought experiment. The idea, roughly, is that if one doesn't know whether a cat in a box is dead or alive, it can be thought of as both dead and alive until the observation confirms one way or the other. In the film, Kira takes the idea to indicate that her missing daughter is both dead and alive until her fate is finally discovered. That is a bit of a misinterpretation and oversimplification of what Erwin Schrödinger's thought experiment actually says. But in order to understand it, we need to know a little bit about quantum mechanics. I know I promised this video was going to be mostly about math, but I think physics still counts since theoretical physics is pretty much just math anyway. One of the remarkable implications of quantum mechanics is that subatomic particles, like electrons or photons, behave very differently from the large-scale things we're used to thinking about. These particles can exist in multiple possible states, each of which is associated with some probability of occurring. However, under the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, it's asserted that until these particles are observed, thus collapsing them into one state or the other, they exist as what's called a superposition. That is, they exist in all of their possible states simultaneously as something like a probability function until that function collapses into a definitive state. Schrödinger, like his colleague Einstein, didn't much care for this idea and came up with his cat problem as a thought experiment to illustrate the ludicrous implications of the notion. He suggested putting a cat into a sealed box with some kind of poison dispenser rigged in such a way that whether or not the cat gets poisoned is connected to the outcome of one of these kinds of quantum events. He then argued that if the particle exists as a superposition and the cat's fate is connected to the particle's behavior, then the cat's fate must also be a superposition. Thus, the cat is both alive and dead until somebody opens the box and observes it. The important thing is that physicists don't agree on their interpretations. The thought experiment succeeded wildly in sparking conversation, but a real solution has not definitively been found. The film's interpretation that Ellie is both alive and dead until her fate is discovered seems to go further than even the most extreme interpretations of quantum theory, and that throwaway line is actually a little bit of an eye-roller in the middle of what's otherwise an interesting conversation. Here's where things get interesting, because one of the possible interpretations of quantum mechanics is the so-called many worlds interpretation. This is the idea that all of the outcomes actually do happen, but they happen in separate parallel universes. Thus, Schrödinger's cat is alive in one universe and dead in another. Of course, this would lead to an uncountably infinite number of parallel universes. And as a side note, there actually is a mathematical difference between countable and uncountable infinities, but that's a discussion for a different day. Many physicists don't particularly care for this interpretation, and the discussions can actually get quite heated. Our job here, though, isn't just to discuss physics, but also to discuss the horror genre, and here's where things can get interesting. Because what the Cellar seems to imply with its mashing together of mathematics, mysticism, and quantum mechanics is that, at least in the world presented in the movie The Cellar, the multiple worlds interpretation, or some version of it, is true, but that these worlds actually can, under extraordinary circumstances, be accessible to one another. It never comes right out and says so, but it seems to be implying that, for instance, the demonic realm, home of Leviathan, the devil, whatever we want to call it, actually can be accessed through application of mathematical discoveries. The idea that parallel universes could be accessible to our universe is not new either. Neither does science confirm it. Right now, it's still the domain of science fiction, such as Stephen Baxter's 1994 novel Ring, not to be confused with the horror movie The Ring, with which it has pretty much nothing in common. Black holes are undeniably real physical phenomena, but their mathematical properties kinda sorta break our conventional understanding of physics. The mathematics of black holes, though, does admit the possibility of hypothetical travel between parallel worlds. This idea that supernatural phenomena could be connected to scientific and mathematical reality is a fascinating one to me. The Cellar only just scratches the surface of barely hinting at the possibilities, but even that's enough to get a nerd like me a little bit excited. As we'll discuss in a later video, Lovecraft made the connections between mathematics and his cosmic horrors much more explicit. But personally, I'd love to see a lot more books and movies taking this idea and running with it into the most horrifying of possible directions. So that brings us to the question for today. What do you think of mathematical horror? Are you excited by the prospect of mathematical knowledge so advanced it threatens our understanding of our place in the world? Or do you prefer to keep your math and your horror separate? Let me know down in the comments. While you're at it, be sure to like this video and share it with your friends. That really helps me out. Finally, coming full circle, all that remains is to offer a final thought on The Cellar. Ultimately, I thought it was a pretty good haunted house story. It never strayed too far from the beaten path, and I really wish it explored its mathematics on a much deeper level, but it did have some good creepy scenes. And it had enough interesting ideas hiding beneath the surface to give me something to talk about, even if I did have to stretch beyond its script a little bit and bring in some ideas of my own to fill in the gaps. With that, it's time once again for me to sign off. So, until next time, take care and stay scared.